This week's parsha begins with the story of the purchase of the Maras Machpelah and the tremendous cooperation of the Bnei Ches and Ephron's failure. Ephron makes it as difficult as possible and ultimately takes from Abraham a tremendous amount of money, 400 shekel kesef. And Chazal contrast the behavior of the Bnei Ches to that of Ephron. The Medrash Rabbah points out that Bnei Ches are mentioned 10 times in the parsha. Bnei Ches, Bnei Ches, Bnei Ches, Bnei Ches. So the Medrash says how much ink was spilled, and how many pens were broken to write the Bnei Ches 10 times in the Sefer Torah. This teaches us that if a person clarifies the purchase of a tzaddik, it's as if he fulfilled the Aseres HaDibros. That's why Bnei Ches are mentioned 10 times. Their schus, their merit, for having been mevarer mekche shel tzaddik, assisting Avraham in the purchase of the Maras Machpelah, so they clarified, we'll see what that expression means in a moment, they clarified the purchase of a tzaddik, it's as if they have the merit of fulfilling the Aseres HaDibros. The Medrash goes on and mentions that when David HaMelech was running from Avshalom, so one of the people that helped him was named Barzillai HaGilodi. And in that parsha, his name is mentioned 5 times. He provided food for David HaMelech and his men. So why is the name mentioned 5 times? The Medrash continues, if a person gives a piece of bread to a tzaddik, he feeds a piece of bread to a tzaddik, it's as if he fulfilled Chamisha Sifrei Torah, as if he fulfilled the Chamisha Chumashim. And that's why Zilai HaGalodi is mentioned 5 times. So the Bnei Ches are mentioned 10 times, because the Muvarer Mekche Shel Tzaddik, if a person clarifies the purchase of a tzaddik, it's as if he fulfilled the Aseres HaDibros. And Barzillai HaGalodi is mentioned 5 times, because if a person gives food to a tzaddik, it's as if he fulfilled the 5 chumashim. That's what the Medrash says. Ephron, on the other hand, is considered the paradigmatic Rasha. The tzaddikim, Chazal tell us, Oimrim ma'at v'esim harbe, they say little and do much, and the Rishoyim, Oimrim harbe, they promise a lot, v'afilu ma'at ein v'esim, they don't do anything. And the illustration of that is Ephron. So you see, by contrast, Ephron falls far short of the Bnei Ches. The Bnei Ches, who were cooperative, have the schus of fulfilling the Aseres HaDibros, and Ephron is the Rasha who promises the world and doesn't do anything. That's what the Medrash says. It's very interesting. Rabbi Chaya in this week's parsha points out that there's another place in Tanakh where we find someone's name mentioned twice. We have the story of David HaMelech, who purchased the site of the Beis HaMikdash from a person who in Shmuel is referred to as Aravna HaYevusi, and in Divrei Hayomim is referred to as Arnon HaYevusi. Same person, same story. We'll see there are minor differences in the story, but this is the story in which David HaMelech purchases the site of the Beis HaMikdash. In the version of the story which is written in Divrei Hayomim, Arnon's name is mentioned 10 times as well. So Rabbi Chaya says this is also an illustration of this principle, that since he assisted David, we'll see in the story that he was not like Ephron. He was extremely cooperative to the extent he wanted to give it for nothing, and David HaMelech insisted on paying for it. So he also was Mevarer Mekche Shel Tzaddik, so his name is also mentioned 10 times. As Chazal say, because if a person is Mevarer Mekche Shel Tzaddik, it's as if you fulfill the Aseres HaDibros. And this Rosh is not in Chazal, this is Rabbi Chaya's own observation, that just as it says Bnei Ches 10 times, it also says Aravna HaYevusi 10 times in Divrei Hayomim. I just want to point out an amazing thing. The Ramami Pano says in the Gilgulei HaNeshamas, he wrote a sefer about Gilgulei HaNeshamas, he writes an amazing thing, that Aravna HaYevusi was a Gilgul of Ephron. And he was Misakein the Chet of Ephron. And Ephron wasn't helpful to Avram when he came to purchase the Maras Machpelah, But in the next Gilgul, Rav Nahayavusi was very cooperative in helping David purchase the site of the Beis HaMikdash. So Rav Nahayavusi was Mesakein the Chet of Ephraim. So therefore, the connection is very poignant. In our parish, we have the Bnei Chais, who are mentioned 10 times. They have the schus of the Aseres Adibros. Ephron is the exception, but in the next Gilgul, Rav Nahayavusi is Mesakein the Chet of Ephron, and therefore he joins the Bnei Chais, and his name is also mentioned 10 times. This is the Bnei Chais. So there are a few questions we have to understand. What is the idea of Mevarer Mekhesh al Tzaddik? What does it mean to clarify the purchase of a tzaddik? Hey, you help the tzaddik, you assist the tzaddik, you support the tzaddik. What is the idea of clarifying the purchase? As we explained many, many years ago, the Gemara in Saita says that just like there's a bas koil 40 days before a child is formed, there's a bas koil who he's going to marry, bas pleni l'pleni. There's also a bas koil which says bias pleni l'pleni and sada pleni l'pleni, that this child will eventually receive that field and that house. That means all the assets that a person acquires in his lifetime are really decreed min hashamayim. There's a basko which determines this is your portion in the resources of Olam Hazeh. So therefore, when you buy something, it isn't so much that you're making it yours, but you're clarifying that this was meant to be yours all along. That's the idea of mevarer mekhesh al tzaddik. When you help the tzaddik buy it, you're really clarifying that it was meant to be his in the first place. That's the lashon of mevarer. Yet it's hard to understand exactly why is it such a great schus. Okay, you help the tzaddik, it's a very nice thing. But that should be considered as if you fulfill the Aseres Adibros. Hard to imagine. What is the great schus of being mevarer mekhesh al tzaddik? Second, you have to understand that the Medrash makes a distinction between the mevarer mekhesh al tzaddik, who's considered as if he kept the Aseres Adibros, and the machal prusalani, and the person who gives bread to the tzaddik rather, who's considered as if he filled the chamisha sifrei Torah, the 5 svarim. And which is bigger? Now, if I told you there are two people, one person keeps the 10 commandments, the other people keeps the 5 chumashim, you would think the person that keeps the 5 chumashim is bigger, because after all, the 5 chumashim comprise all the taryag mitzvahs. But here it seems from this medrash that the schus of keeping the Aseres Adibros in some way is bigger than the schus of keeping the 5 chumashim, because the person who keeps this mevarer mekhesh al tzaddik is mentioned 10 times, because he kept the Aseres Adibros. The person who keeps the 5 chumashim is not mentioned 613 times, he's mentioned 5 times, he's mentioned fewer times. So it seems from the context of the Medrash that in some way the person who's Mekayim Aseres Adibros is greater than the person who's Mekayim the 5 svarim. So what does that mean? Aseres Adibros is fewer mitzvahs than the 5 chumashim. So why should it be a greater schus? Almost double, it seems. That if you're mevarer mekhesh al tzaddik, you're mentioned 10 times, like Bnei Chais and Rav Nahayavusi. If you're Michael Prusim the tzaddik, if you give bread to the tzaddik, you're only mentioned 5 times, like Barzilai Galoti. So it seems that it's much less. It's much smaller. So in what way is it possible that keeping the Aseres Adibros is a greater schus than keeping the 5 chumashim? Another question we have to ask is that Rabbi Chaya says that this story that Rav Nahayavusi is also considered mevarer mekhesh al tzaddik is merumas in the version of the story in Divrei Hayomim. There, Rav Nahayavusi's name is mentioned 10 times. Now, if you look in the account in Shmuel, there his name is mentioned 9 times. The story is told a little differently. His name is mentioned 9 times, and of course 9 is not a symbolic number at all. There's 5 corresponds to the 5 chumashim, 10 corresponds to the Aseres Adibros, 9 corresponds to neither. So that means that the 9 references to Rav Nahayavusi in Shmuel, the first time the story is told, are irrelevant. There's no significance of the number of times he's mentioned. He's mentioned that number of times because to tell the story, he has to be mentioned that number of times. It's only in the version in Divrei Hayomim where he's mentioned apparently 1 extra time to make it around 10. There it has significance as Rabbi Chaya that it's the 10 times that correspond to the Aseres Adibros. So the question is that why is this great merit of Rav Nahayavusi only mentioned in the version of Divrei Hayomim and for some reason not in the version of Shmuel? Now, the truth is this. The truth is, Chazal point out there's a very big contradiction between the version in Shmuel and the version in Divrei Hayam. In the version of Shmuel, it says that David HaMelech purchased the Geirin, the threshing floor, for 50 shkalim. And in Divrei Hayam, it says he purchased it for 600 shkalim. So there's a contradiction as to how much he paid for the property of Aravna. So the Gemara gives two tirutzim. We're going to focus on the second teretz the Gemara gives, but just so you won't be troubled, I'll tell you the first teretz. The first teretz is a very simple teretz. That David HaMelech collected 50 shkalim from each of the 12 shvatim, and that was a total of 600 shkalim. So therefore, in the Shmuel it mentions the amount he collected from each shevet, and the Rayam mentions the amount that he collected from all the shvatim. But this is the only contradiction that the Gemara points out. But the truth is, when we study the two stories, we're going to discover that there are many, many other contradictions, many subtle differences between the two stories. And this will clarify the issue at hand. So I gave you the handout, which really has the two parshiyas. Let me give you a little background. That these two chapters begin with the following idea. It says that the Ribono Shel Olam was angry at Klal Yisrael. Rashi says we don't know why. He was angry at Klal Yisrael, and the Ribono Shel Olam therefore seduced David HaMelech into committing a terrible aveira. You know, aveira gereres aveira. There's one sin brings on another sin. So if you commit one aveira, HaKadosh Baruch Hu makes you do a second aveira, and then He punishes you for that second aveira. So Hashem was angry. We don't know why He was angry, but because He was angry, He seduced David to commit an aveira for which Klal Yisrael was punished. What was the aveira that He convinced David to do? To take a census. Now, among the Mefarshim, there's a big machlokes. What exactly was the chet? Did he take the census without shkalim? Maybe that was the chet, or maybe the chet was taking a census at all is a chet, but whatever it was a chet. And because of this chet, Hashem told David, I'm going to give you a choice of punishments. And He gave him 3 choices, and David HaMelech chose that there should be a magefa, there should be a plague. The other alternatives were worse. He chose there should be a plague. There was Nipla na v'yad Hashem ki rabim rachmo. Let me fall into Hashem's hands because He's abundant in mercy. V'yad adam al ha'payil. Let me not fall into human hands. So we chose there should be a magefa. And there was a magefa. There was a plague. 77,000 people were killed in one day in this magefa. And there was a malach that brought about the magefa. And the malach was spotted in the air hovering over Yerushalayim. And the malach had a sword drawn over Yerushalayim. And at that moment, Hashem told the malach to stop, to pause temporarily. Why did Hashem tell the malach to stop? The Midrashim give various reasons. One of them was that he saw this was the place of the Akedah, so the schus of the Akedah protected us. HaKadosh Baruch Hu told the malach to stop. But David HaMelech saw this malach hovering over Yerushalayim, temporarily having paused. So it says in the pasuk that God, the Navi God, came to David HaMelech and told him that he should build a mizbeach, he should build an altar on the threshing floor of this Aravna HaYevusi. Now Aravna HaYevusi was, according to the Gemara of Zar, he was a ger taishav. He was not Jewish, he was a Gentile, but he was makabel. He accepted upon himself to observe the Yeshiva mitzvahs b'nei Nayach, so he was given the right to live in Eretz Yisrael. And the message was sent by God to David HaMelech to purchase the Geiren and to build a mizbeach there, and that will stop the magefa, that will stop the plague. So David HaMelech went to Aravna, and Aravna asked the king, why did you come? And he said, I came to purchase the Geiren to build a mizbeach in order to stop the magefa, in order to stop the plague. So Aravna told the king, take it for nothing. And not only that, says, you see the cattle I have, and you see the farm implements I have, take it all. You can use the cattle as korbanos, and the farm implements which are made of wood, you can use as wood for the korbanos. So you use it, so it's all yours. So David HaMelech says, Chas v'sholom, God forbid, I don't want to bring karbonos for nothing. I'm going to pay full price. So he paid the full price, and David HaMelech brought the karbonos. That's the story. And the Magefa was ended thereby. Now, if you compare the two versions of the story, the version in Shmuel and the version of Divrei Hayamim, there are a number of very, very important differences. It says, number one, in the version in Shmuel, in verse Yud Ches, it appears that this was God's own idea. That God told David HaMelech that build a mizbeach, bring karbanos, and that will end the Magefa. In Divrei Hayamim, it's clear that it was a Malach who told God to go to David, meaning that this was a shlichus from Ribono Shel Olam, that he should go to David and tell him to build the mizbeach. Number two, when David explained to Aravna why he came, there's a very interesting difference. If you look in the section from Shmuel at the top of the page, in Pasuk Chaf Aleph, it says, Vayomer David said, Liknais me'imcha es ha'goyren, I've come to buy the goyren, the threshing floor, Livnais mizbeach l'Hashem, to build a mizbeach, v'se'atze'ar ha'magefa me'al ha'am, and this will stop the plague. If you look in the version of Divrei Hayamim, in Pasuk Chav Beis, David says to Arnon, Tunali mekayim ha'goyren, give me the place of the goyren, which means not just the goyren, but it means the surrounding area as well. Ve'evne b'mizbeach l'Hashem, and I'll build a mizbeach. V'kesef malek ne'oli, give it to me for full price. V'se'atzar makifa me'al ha'am, and the plague will be averted. Now there are two differences. In the first version in Shmuel, he just asks for the goyren. I've come to buy the goyren. In the second version, he says, give me the makom ha-goyren. Give me the place of the goyren. And as we'll see, the Mefarshim seem to understand that the place of the goyren means not only the threshing floor itself, but it means the surrounding area. So he was asking for more. But also, in the first version, he says, sell it to me. And the second version, he says, give it to me. But of course, he doesn't mean give it to me for nothing. So that necessitates his adding that give it to me for the full price, which is kind of a roundabout expression, which of course Avram Avinu also uses in this week's parsha. He says, give me the aras machpelah b'kesef malei, for full price, let him give it to me. So if he's paying for it, why do you say let him give it to me? You say let him sell it to me. Then you don't have to add, and I'll pay the full price. You only have to add that expression for the full price, since you're saying let him give it to me, so a person can make a mistake and assume that means I want it as a gift. So you have to speak out, no, I'll give it to him for the full price. So why does David use that expression? And again, only in Divrei Hayamim, in the version of Shmuel, that expression is not used. Now there's another very, very interesting difference. And what to make of this difference is very interesting. When Aravna Yehusi tells David, I'll give it to you for nothing. So in the version of Shmuel, he says, listen, he says, I'll give you the cattle, and I'll give you the farm implements, so you'll have the bakar, you'll have the cattle for karbonos, but you have the farm implements for wood. In the version of Divrei Hayamim, it mentions earlier in the story that at the time, he was threshing wheat. He was actually using the threshing floor. And the reason that detail was added is because in the version of Divrei Hayamim, he says to David, listen, I'll give you the cattle for karbonos, and I'll give you the farm implements for wood, and I'll give you the chitim, I'll give you the wheat for carbon mincha. And in the version of Shmuel, it's not mentioned. There's no mention of giving the wheat for the carbon mincha. And that's why in the version of Shmuel, there's no mention that he was using the threshing floor at the time. Because the wheat is apparently irrelevant to the version of Shmuel. But here, since the wheat is mentioned, that Rav Yehusi promised he would give not only the cattle, not only the wooden farm implements, but he would give the wheat as well, so therefore it has to mention what wheat. So it mentioned that he was threshing wheat, so there was wheat there, and then he said, I'll give you the wheat as well. So what's the significance of the fact that in the one version there's no mention of the wheat, and the other version there's a mention of the wheat? Another difference is that when David HaMelech responded to Aravna, when Aravna said, I'll give it to you for nothing, so the answer in the two places is different. In the version of Shmuel, he says, Vayomer HaMelech al Ravna, he says to Ravna, Loi, no, Ki kano eknem yoschab mechir. I will buy it from you for a price. V'lo alel Hashem Elokai oilai schinam. I'm not going to bring oilas to Hashem for nothing. And by the way, the Zohar HaKadosh proves from here, brings the idea that when you do a mitzvah, you should pay for it. Whereas you shouldn't do a mitzvah for nothing. You see, David HaMelech said, in a big karbonos, I insist on paying for it. And the Chaya paskins this. There's a simon in Chaya where he talks about rules that apply to mitzvahs. So one of the rules he says generally is that a person should not do a mitzvah for nothing. If someone gives you a lulav and an esrog, that's not lachatchila. Lachatchila, you should buy a mitzvah. And therefore, that's what David HaMelech said. I don't want to be given gifts. I will pay for the animals. I don't want to bring oilais chinam. I don't want to bring oilas for nothing. But if you look in the version in Divrei Hayamim, he says two different things. This is the pasuk Chav Daled. He says, "Loi, no, ki kano ekne bekesef molai. I will purchase it for a full price. Ki lo esa asher lecha. I will not raise up that which is yours, Lashem, to Hashem. V'ha'alais oila chinam, and I will not bring an oila for nothing." So he seems to be saying two different things. He's saying, I'm not going to elevate that which is yours, and I'm not going to bring up oilais for nothing. So what is the double expression? What are the two things that David HaMelech is referring to? Now we also pointed out, Chazal point out this difference, that there's a contradiction as far as the amount of money goes. That in the version of Shmuel it says 50 shkalim, and in the version of Divrei Hayamim it mentions 600 shkalim. But there are two other differences. In the version of Shmuel, it says he brought the karbonos, and the Mageifa ended. In the version of Divrei Hayamim, if you look in Pasuk Chavav, it mentions the fact that not just that he brought the karbonos, but Hashem sent fire min hashamayim, and the fire descended from heaven and consumed the karbonos, which is a noteworthy thing. So why is this not mentioned in the version of Shmuel, and why is it mentioned in the version of Divrei Hayamim? And finally, and this is probably the most blatant difference, that pasuk, that last pasuk, Vayiven Shem David Mizbeach L'Hashem in Shmuel, and he brought the karbonos, and the Mageifa ended, is the last pasuk in Sefer Shmuel. That's the conclusion of Sefer Shmuel, the last pasuk, the absolute last pasuk, Sefer Shmuel, and then the next Sefer, Sefer Malachim, begins with the account of the death of David HaMelech. In Sefer Divrei Hayamim, the story continues, and it mentions that David declares that this site, the site of the Garden of Aron HaYevusi, this will be the site of the Beis HaMikdash. He says, Zehu Beis Hashem Hu Elokim, this is going to be the house of Hashem, V'zeh Mizbeach La'ila Yisrael, and this is the site of the altar for Yisrael, and there are 8 chapters that follow which talk about the preparations that David makes for the building of the Beis HaMikdash, of which there is no mention in Sefer Shmuel. As soon as he brings the karbonos and the Mageifa ends, that's the end of Sefer Shmuel, and the beginning of Sefer Malachim already talks about the preparations for the death of David HaMelech. But in Divrei Hayamim, you have, after this story, that he brings the karbonos and the fire comes down in Hashemayim, he identifies the site as being the place of the ultimate Beis HaMikdash. There are 8 prakim that follow that talk about the groundwork that David HaMelech lays for the building of the Beis HaMikdash, until the stories then realign, and Divrei Hayamim continues with the stories that begin in the beginning of Malachim. And all of this is omitted from Sefer Shmuel. So a lot of differences. How do we account for the differences? The truth is this. Let me give you a bit of information, which is a very, very interesting bit. The stories began that Hashem was angry at Klal Yisrael, and therefore, in order to punish them, HaKadosh Baruch Hu seduced David to committing an Aveira, for which he would punish Klal Yisrael. So because Hashem was angry, so therefore he convinced David, he persuaded David to conduct the census, and then they were punished with a Mageifa for conducting the census. Why was Hashem angry? Like he was angry for some earlier sin, and therefore they caused the second sin, and therefore there was a Mageta. So what was the first sin? So Rashi in Shmuel says he doesn't know. Doesn't know what the sin was. There's a Ramban in Parshas Chukas that the Ramban says what the sin was. Long Ramban. The Ramban says that it seems, if you look at the story, read between the lines, the chet was the sin that the Jews were negligent in delaying the building of the Beis HaMikdash. It means like this. We've explained this many times. That there really are two mitzvahs that are associated with the Beis HaMikdash. First, there's the mitzvah of V'asam HaMikdash V'shechanti B'soicham, that there should be a place for bringing the karbanos. This was fulfilled with the Mishkan and the Midbar. When they came into Eretz Yisrael, the Mishkan was in a number of places, was in Gilgal, and Shiloh, and Nov, and Givon, and so on and so forth. But there's a mitzvah to build the permanent, final Beis HaMikdash. And we've pointed out, again, many times, that there's a basic difference between the two mitzvahs. The mitzvah of the Mishkan, which was fulfilled in the Midbar, is V'asu li Migdash v'shechanti b'soicham. Build the Beis HaMikdash, and then I will come. Because you build the Mishkan, and then the Shechina descends. The mitzvah to build the final Beis HaMikdash is the opposite. L'shichnai sidrishu uvasa shama. Seek the place of the Shechina, and then come to that place and build a sanctuary. That's what Yerushalayim is. Yerushalayim is not, we built the Beis HaMikdash there for the Shechina came. The Shechina was there. That's the place of the Shechina, and that's why we built the Beis HaMikdash there. So there's a separate mitzvah to build the final place. So although they had a Mishkan, they had the Mishkan in the Midbar, and they had the Mishkan in Eretz Yisrael, again in Gilgal, and Shiloh, and Nov, and Givon, but that wasn't the fulfillment of this mitzvah of L'shich Neisid Rishut. There's a mitzvah to build the final resting place, to identify the place of the Shechina, and build the Beis HaMikdash there. That, of course, ultimately was done by Shlomo Melech, but this was hundreds of years after the Jews left Mitzrayim. It was 440 years after Klal Yisrael came into Eretz Yisrael that Shlomo HaMelech began the building of the Beis HaMikdash. It was 480 years after the Yetzias Mitzrayim. So 440 years after the Jews entered in Eretz Yisrael, this mitzvah was not fulfilled. It was delayed, and it was done only then. And really, it should have been done before. Even though David HaMelech himself had wanted to, and he was told by Nasan Hanavi that he couldn't do it because since he spilled so much blood, he wouldn't be allowed to do it. But says the Ramban, if the initiative would have come from the grassroots, if it would have come from Klal Yisrael, it wouldn't have been called that David was doing it. In other words, it couldn't be that David was the one that would spearhead the campaign. But if the initiative would have come from Klal Yisrael, that wouldn't have been a problem. And they pushed off, they delayed, and therefore there was a punishment. Says the Ramban, how do I know that's the problem? Because I see that in the punishment, HaKadosh Baruch Hu was merames to what the chet was. The Malach standing with his sword over Yerushalayim, obviously that's a remez to what the sin was. It must be that the original sin, not the sin of the census, but the sin that preceded the census, had to do something with Yerushalayim. And therefore, when David HaMelech bought the Mizbeach from Rabbi Yebusi, says the Ramban, it wasn't just to build a Mizbeach, to bring a carbon, to be an atonement for the sin of the census. It was a tikkun, it was a rectification of the original sin of delaying the building of the Beis HaMikdash, which was the sin that started the whole domino effect and brought about this terrible calamity. This is what the Ramban says. But it's very, very interesting. If you compare the two stories, and this is not printed on the sheet, the fact that the Malach stood with his sword drawn over Yerushalayim, which by the way is a very familiar pasuk because it's in the Pesach Haggadah, that pasuk is only in the version of Divrei Hayamim. In the version in Shmuel, there is no mention of the fact the Malach was hovering over Yerushalayim. It just says that the Malach was bein Shemayim v'aretz. He was between heaven and earth. That idea that the Malach was hovering over Yerushalayim is only mentioned in Divrei Hayamim. which seems to me as follows. It seems to me that, because this story can be understood on two levels. On one level, God is telling David HaMelech, bring a carbon, because a carbon is a kapara. So here there's a chet. What was the chet? The chet was, he took the census. Forget what the chet that you had done before that caused the Kadosh Baruch Hu to seduce you to commit the second chet. Put that aside. But you did a chet. You took the census. And that chet brought a punishment, brought a magefa. Now there's a temporary pause. We want the magefa to end. So you bring a carbon. A carbon is a kapara, it's an atonement. It'll solve the problem of the magefa. Well, you can't just bring a carbon anywhere. You have to have the mizbeach, and you have to have the cattle. You need all the things. So go and buy it from a Rav Nahayusi. This is where they were. They were just at that place. It was a convenient place to go. The version in Shmuel has nothing to do with the selection of this place as the Beis HaMikdash. It is not that we bought the Geirin of a Rav Nahayusi to rectify the original sin which was at the root of everything. This is a version of the story where all David is trying to accomplish is to solve the immediate problem. There's a magefa, for which there's a temporary pause. So let's bring a carbon is a kapara, and that will avert the magefa. That's all he wants to do. In Divrei Hayomim, it's a totally different version of the story. Here, the interest of David is not just to solve the immediate problem, which is the magefa, which is a consequence of taking the census. David wants to massacre the underlying chet, which was the neglect of the mitzvah to build the Beis HaMikdash. Here the concern is that he wants to identify the place of the Shechina, and lay the groundwork for building the ultimate Beis HaMikdash. Now that accounts for the major difference in the two stories. In the version of the story in Shmuel, he brings the korbanos, the magefa ends, and that's the end of the story. That's it. Because in the version of the story in Shmuel, the only important part of the story is the fact that there's a magefa. The magefa has to be stopped. You bring the korbanos, that'll stop the magefa. A carbon is a kapara. You bring the carbon, the magefa is over, and that's where the entire book of Shmuel ends. So after that, we go on to the death of David HaMelech. Right? In Divrei Hayomim, the concern of the story is totally different. The concern of the story is because David HaMelech is purchasing the Gurn Arav Nahayabusi not just for the purpose of this carbon, which will end the Magefa. It's to deal with the underlying issue that the whole original chet was delaying the building of the Beis HaMikdash. So we have to l'shich no sidrusha. We have to identify the place of the Shechina. And therefore, this becomes the place of the Beis HaMikdash. And therefore, David HaMelech continues, and he says, Zehu Beis Hashem Elokim, this is the house of God, this is the site of the Mizbeach forever, and that's why we have 8 prakim, right, that deal with this issue entirely, which is David HaMelech laying the groundwork and the plans for the Beis HaMikdash, which will ultimately be completed by his son, Shlomo. Now, if you go through all the Ramazim in the Parsha, now we understand. For example, that's why the Eish min HaShamayim, the fire coming down, right, is critical to the version of Divrei Hayomim, but not relevant to the version in Shmuel. In other words, in Shmuel, where the purpose of the carbon is simply to be machaper for the chet of taking the census, okay, you brought the carbon. But in Divrei Hayomim, where the emphasis is on the fact that this is the site of the Beis HaMikdash, so we know there's a halacha when it comes to the site of the Beis HaMikdash. It says in the pasuk that you have to come to the place Asher Yivchar Hashem Elokecha Bo. It has to be the place that God chooses. So there has to be some divine sign that this is the place, this is the spot. That's the significance of the Eish coming down the Hashemayim. That when David brings a carbon on that place, the fire comes down from heaven is to say, yes, this is the place that I have chosen. If it's just a question of bringing a carbon as a kapara, so you can bring a carbon anyway. You can bring it back in Givon, back in where the Mishkan is. Right? When the Mishkan was in Givon, Bamos were permitted. You could make a Mizbeach anywhere. But here, the idea is we're selecting the site of the Beis HaMikdash, and therefore, that's what the Eish min HaShamayim symbolizes. Another interesting thing about the chitim, the wheat, now becomes very interesting. There's a Mishnah in Maseches Zvachim brings the shita of Rabbi Yehuda that ein mincha b'bama. On a private altar, on a bama, you couldn't make a carbon mincha. And Rashi, Tosfos explains in Zvachim and Kufya Tes that even means a bama gedola. Even the Mishkan, even in the Mishkan of Givon, Nova Givon, you also couldn't make a carbon mincha. So the question is like this: when David HaMelech built this altar, what was it? In other words, as far as the version of Shmuel is concerned, we're not talking about building the Beis HaMikdash. It just as well could have been a private bama, right? You're bringing a bama in order to deflect the Mageifa. So when Rav Yevusi agrees to supply what's necessary, so he mentions the bakar and he mentions the wood, doesn't mention the chitim, because you can't bring a mincha and a bama. But in the version of Divrei Hayamim, where it's clear that David HaMelech is identifying this place as the place of the Makom Beis HaMikdash, where you can bring a mincha, so that's why the emphasis on the fact is that there were chitim there. And Rav Yevusi said that not only will I give you bakar, not only will I give you the wood, I'll give you chitim for a mincha as well, because if you're designating this as the place of the Beis HaMikdash, so you can make a carbon mincha there, and therefore you need chitim as well. Now, I'm reluctant to say this because that presumes that this Rav Yevusi was a very brilliant Talmud Chacham in his own right, that he could figure this out, that trying to chitim. But certainly al derech hadrush, I think it's a very, very nice interpretation. See, there's also another point over here. In Shmuel, the emphasis is only on the bringing of the carbon. He says, I want to buy the goyren. I want to buy the threshing floor, which is the site of the Mizbeach, and to build a Mizbeach. In Divrei Hayamim, it says he wants the Makom HaGoyren, and we find that means he wants the surrounding area. Because it's not just the Mizbeach. The purchase he's making is not just to facilitate the bringing of this carbon. He wants to build the Beis HaMikdash. He wants the entire site of the Beis HaMikdash. So he doesn't only want the Goyren, which is the Makom of the Mizbeach, he wants the Makom HaGoyren. He wants the vicinity of the Goyren, because he needs the site for the Beis HaMikdash. And the truth is that there's a Mandamer in the Gemara who really points this out. That the contradiction as far as the amount of money, the Gemara brings a second opinion which says that the 50 shkalim were for the Goyren and for the bakar, and the 600 shkalim was for the entire property. So the question is, so why is it in Shmuel was only a mention of the 50 and Divrei Hayamim was a mention of the 600? The Lefit Verenu, it makes perfect sense. Because in Shmuel, we're only interested in the carbon to stop the Mageifa. So therefore, the only thing which is relevant to the story is what David HaMelech paid for the place of the Mizbeach and for the cattle and the wood to bring the karbanos. Right? In Divrei Hayamim, we're dealing with much broader concern, which is the question of purchasing and laying the ground for the building of the Beis HaMikdash. So there's a reference to what David HaMelech paid for the whole property, which was 600 shkalim. And in Shmuel, we only mentioned the 50 shkalim. And that's also why in Shmuel, there's no emphasis on the fact that this command to build the Mizbeach was from Hashem, whereas in Divrei Hayamim it is mentioned. The answer is Pashut. Because if you're thinking of the carbon only in terms of being Otzer the Mageifa, then that could be a human being's idea. It doesn't have to be a divine idea. You did a chet, you bring a carbon, we all know that. But if we're talking about identifying the site of the Beis HaMikdash, as we said, that there's a halacha of a makom HaShegir for Hashem, so a lot of the initiative has to come from the Ribono Shel Olam, and that's why in Divrei Hayamim the emphasis is on the Ribono Shel Olam sending a malach to tell God to do this. Now, the difference between the normal expression of I want to buy something, or give it to me and I'll pay you the full price, which we found by Avraham Avinu also in the sixth parsha, is also explained with this, and it's very, very pasha. The Mepharshim explain that if I buy something from you, but it's so important to me that whatever I pay it's as if you gave it to me as a gift. So you use that expression. Give it to me as a gift, and I'll pay you the full price. Meaning, I'll pay you the full price, but it's not as if I'm buying it from you. Even after I pay the full price, it appears to me as if it's a gift. That depends on what we're talking about. So in the version of Shmuel, we're talking about the Makam HaMizbeach. That's a regular halacha that, as the Navi says, that when you do a mitzvah, you should pay for it. So there, David HaMelech says simply, I'm here to buy the Goyren in order to build a Mizbeach to bring this carbon. Here it's considered in David's eyes a purchase. But when he speaks about the aspect that he's buying the entire property, this should be the ultimate site of the Beis HaMikdash. It's not just to deal with the immediate problem of the Magefa, but it's to be the ultimate site of the Beis HaMikdash. Viri puts it much more poetically. This is so important to me that whatever you make me pay for it, it's really only it's as if you're giving it to me as a gift. Therefore, that's why he puts it that way. Of course, that necessitates him speaking out. If I'm saying, give it to me, I have to speak out, but give it to me for the full price, because otherwise you might make a mistake and think it really is meant to be a gift. So in Shmuel, where it talks about the buying the Mizbeach simply that it should be as if he paid for it, there he can speak of it as a purchase. In Divrei Hayam, where he's speaking about the site of the Beis HaMikdash, there he calls it a gift, because whatever he pays for, it's really a gift. And when a rabbin offers it for nothing, that's why in Shmuel, David simply says, no, I'm not going to bring an Ola for nothing. Right? And here he gives two answers. He says, I'm not going to give an Ola for nothing, and I'm not going to raise that which is yours to Hashem, because here there's two different issues. There's the issue of bringing the carbon to stop the Magefa. That I won't do for nothing. But there's a broader issue, which is that I'm not going to build the Beis HaMikdash on a place which is not totally mine. And therefore, I won't uplift that which is yours to Hashem. That won't be the site of the Beis HaMikdash either. I think we've gone through all the differences in the parsha. But it comes out that there's two different issues in these two different parshas. There's the immediate problem, which is there's a Magefa, and that Magefa can be stopped with a carbon, and a carbon has to be paid for. You don't bring a carbon for nothing. And that's the subject of Sefer Shmuel. In Divrei Hayam, we're dealing with a much more fundamental issue, which is rectifying the original sin which brought about the sin of the census, which is the sin of delaying the building of the Beis HaMikdash. So here David is coming to identify the site of the Beis HaMikdash. It's a totally different issue. That accounts for all the differences. That's why in the earlier parsha we're only talking about the expenditure that was necessary for the carbon to be owed to the Magefa. In Divrei Hayam we're talking about the expense that was necessary to buy the entire property for the building of the Beis HaMikdash. And that's why in Shmuel, as soon as the Magefa is over, the book ends. And Divrei Hayam, we have 8 prakim that deal with the groundwork for building the Beis HaMikdash, because that's the theme of Divrei Hayam. Let's go back to the Medrash. The difference between a nicing, hamachal prusel of tzaddik, a person who gives bread to the tzaddik, and the person who's mavara mekhay shel tzaddik. And the question is, what is the difference between the two? And why is the one compared to the person who observes the Aseret Sedibros, and the other is compared to a person who observes the Chumashim? And we pointed out several times, the Maral asks, what is the idea that we have two parts of Torah? We have a part of Torah called Taryag Mitzvahs, which is contained in the Chamisha Chumshei Torah. There's a different part of Torah, which is the Aseret Sedibros, which is carbon Meluchas. And why do we have two different categories of mitzvahs? So Maral explained that there are really two aspects to Torah. It says, the number 10 always corresponds to something about the Ribono Shel Olam, some aspect of divine self-revelation. But the Kadosh Baruch Hu revealed himself as the creator when he created the world with 10 statements. He revealed himself, according to the Mekubalim, with Eser Sfiros. In Mitzrayim, as the liberator, he revealed himself with Eser Makos. Right? As the lawgiver, he reveals himself with Aseret Sedibros. Because one aspect of Torah is that Torah is divine self-revelation. HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants us to know something about Him, what's important to Him. That's the idea of Aseret Sedibros. And this is the aspect of Torah that through Torah man can come to understand God. There's another aspect of Torah, which is the idea that it's the ultimate self-help book. It gives us the instructions for good living, how to make ourselves the best people we can be. So that corresponds to Taryag Mitzvahs, because the Zohar HaKadosh says that the 613 mitzvahs correspond to the 613 parts of a human being. There are 248 Evarim, body parts, and 365 sinews. So together that is 613. So therefore the number of mitzvahs corresponds to the parts of the body, because if a person has that many body parts, so each has to be rectified with a mitzvah. So Taryag mitzvahs, which is contained within the Chamishu Chumshei Seira, that is the aspect of Torah which is really Torah Sa'odam. It's the refinement of a human being, the perfection of a human being. The Aseret Dibros is a different category. That's divine self-revelation. We pointed out many years ago that this explains why the Aseret Dibros are written on stone and why the Taryag mitzvahs are written on parchment, on cloth. Stone is an unchanging thing. And we know that the hallmark of the Rebbeinu Shalom is his unchanging nature. Ani Hashem lo shanisi, I've never changed. And therefore, the Aseret Dibros, which are the aspect of Torah as divine self-revelation, is therefore carved in stone. The very expression carved in stone implies something which is permanent and unchanging. It says the cloth, the parchment of the Sefer Torah, is something organic. It's part of an animal. It grows, it lives, it dies, it decays. That corresponds to the human being. Therefore, the Torah of the human being, the refinement of the human being, that's in the Chamishu Chumshei Sarah. In a pure numerical sense, you would say it's a bigger accomplishment to observe Taryag mitzvahs and to observe the Aseret Dibros. But what we're talking about is something else. A person who observes Taryag mitzvahs, he's achieved very lofty levels of human perfection. But observing Aseret Dibros means more. That he's come to understand what Rebbeinu Shalom is all about, what's important to him, what his viewpoint is, what his ideals are, what he stands for. So in a sense, 10 is fewer than Taryag, but observing Aseret Dibros may symbolize something which is not contained in the observance of Taryag mitzvahs. A person can observe Taryag mitzvahs and he's perfected himself. He's developed his character, his personality, the sterling midas, and so on and so forth. He's observed Taryag mitzvahs in the 5 Chumashim. But a person who's observed Aseret Dibros means he's tapped into that body of knowledge, which is divine self-revelation. He's come to understand what the Rebbeinu Shalom is all about. That's a loftier level. A person who gives a prusa to the tzaddik, if you feed the tzaddik, it's an act of charity, it's an act of chesed. It shows wonderful exemplary midas on your part, caring, compassion. That's a wonderful thing. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu says that if a person does that, I consider it as if he kept the entire Torah. Right? Because the entire Torah is really the refinement of the human being. The purpose of Torah is to perfect the person, so this is such an important aspect of it. That a person is charitable and kind and compassionate and he helps people. So if a person gives a prusa to a tzaddik, I will consider it as if he kept the entire Taryag mitzvahs. But it doesn't show that he understands what's important to the Rebbeinu Shalom. He's a good person. And he's such a good person, it's considered as if he achieved the refinement which is achieved through the entire body of 5 Chumashim, which is Taryag mitzvahs. But Mavara Mekha Shal Tzaddik is something else. Because the property of a tzaddik, what is the property? What does the tzaddik do with this property? The property of a tzaddik are the tools with which he realizes his mission in life. That's the property of a tzaddik. So if a person is Mavara Mekha Shal Tzaddik, you assist the tzaddik in clarifying his purchases. That means it's not just you're a good person, you're a compassionate person, you're a kind person. You understand what the purpose of life is, what is the objective of the tzaddik, what is he trying to achieve. And you are Mavar Nekrish Shal Tzaddik, you assist him in acquiring the kelim, acquiring the means, the tools that he needs to fulfill that mission. That's a loftier level. That's as if you observe the Aseret Dibros. In other words, if a person understands that it's imperative that I help the tzaddik acquire these tools that he needs, not for his physical survival, but he needs for his purpose, right? That's already tantamount to observing the Aseret Dibros. So a person who merely gives a prusa to the tzaddik sustains his life, well, of course we all understand that. Who wouldn't want to help a person who's starving? That person is dying of starvation. Of course you help him. That shows compassion, good midas. You're a kind person, a generous person. That's as if you observe Taryag mitzvahs, as if you observe the Chamish Chumashim. But to help a tzaddik acquire physical possessions, for what? So what do you need him for? That's because you understand that his mission requires he has these things. That's Mavar Nekhesh Shal Tzadik. So where do Chazal speak about Mavar Nekhesh Shal Tzadik? They don't speak about it, in cases where the Tzadik is merely acquiring things that he needs as luxuries. the two places where it's talked about is Avraham Avinu acquiring the Maras Machpelah, and the other Melech acquiring the Beis HaMikdash. These aren't even things they needed for themselves, right? These were things that were integral to their mission of building Klal Yisrael. That Avraham Avinu had to build a burial place that will be a shrine to the memory of the Avos from whom we receive everything. So therefore Klal Yisrael needs to venerate the burial place of the Avos, and of course the Beis HaMikdash, its necessity is self-understood. So Reiches, who helped Abraham purchase the Maras Machpelah, and Rav Nahirusi, Al David, and part of the Beis HaMikdash, these are people that are Mavar Nekhesh Shal Tzadik. They provided not just sustenance to the Tzadik, which is a function of Midas Tevas. They provided what the Tzadik needs to fulfill his tachlis, to fulfill his purpose. That's tantamount to already Aseres HaDibros. But that's why the story, the 10 times that the Arnon or Ravna is mentioned, is only rumors in the Sefer Divrei Hayamim. In Shmuel, right, the issue in Shmuel is a question of saving lives. There's a Mageifa, we have to save lives, right? You bring a carbon, it's a Mechaper, it'll stop the Mageifa. That's a very wonderful thing. That's not Mavar Nekhesh Shal Tzadik. Mavar Nekhesh Shal Tzadik is only in the story of Divrei Hayamim, where there the question is, David is not purchasing this Mizbeach simply to bring a carbon that will stop the Mageifa, right? It's much more fundamental. It's to identify the place of the Beis HaMikdash. So here, he's making a purchase to fulfill his mission in this world. That's Mavar Nekhesh Shal Tzadik, and that's considered like he kept the Aseres HaDibros, and that's why the 10 references are only rumors in that story and not in the story in Sefer Shmuel.